Until that moment, I thought I was the sole owner of this land. But one morning, there she was, standing at my gate in that blinding orange suit, declaring this land is no longer yours. She handed me a list of violations I'd never heard of. My daughter stood beside me, her eyes wide in confusion, asking, "Dad, are we really going to have to move?" Right then, I knew the fight was on. I wouldn't let anyone take my land. If you're dealing with people trying to control your life, just know you're not alone, and it's time to fight back. My name is Clint Maynard, and I've been living peacefully on Red Cholla Ranch for the past 8 years with my wife Loretta and our 8-year-old daughter Maisie. The ranch isn't much to look at. 20 acres of Arizona desert dotted with red Cholla cacti and ancient mesquite trees. A modest house my grandfather built in 1953, and a small chicken coop where we keep 6 hens. I make my living as a freelance writer, specializing in local history books about the Southwest. It's quiet work that lets me stay home with my family while researching fascinating stories buried in courthouse records and old newspaper archives. Life was simple, predictable, and exactly how I liked it, until that woman in the bright orange suit showed up at my gate. As soon as I saw her stepping out of that car in her glaring orange suit, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I had never felt so violated in my life. Here was a stranger, standing at the gates of my home, telling me that everything I knew was about to change. In 8 years of living here, we'd never had any kind of homeowners association. Hell, half our neighbors didn't even live in actual houses. Webb had her double white trailer, the Martinez family lived in a converted barn they'd been fixing up for years, and old Pete down the road had been camping in an RV on his property for as long as anyone could remember. We were all just folks trying to live our lives without bothering each other. The idea that someone could suddenly show up and start telling us how to live felt fundamentally wrong, like someone claiming they owned the air we breathed. She introduced herself as Deborah Winslow, chairwoman of the Sonoran Vista Homeowners Authority, accompanied by 2 other women carrying clipboards. Deborah stood out in that blazing orange business suit, complete with matching leather purse and stiletto heels that kept sinking into our gravel driveway. She smiled confidently, but I caught the coldness in her eyes. Looked like she wasn't doing this for the first time. "Mr. Maynard," she said, consulting her papers with theatrical importance, "I'm here to inform you of multiple serious violations of our community standards that require immediate attention and substantial fines." As she spoke, I found myself studying her mannerisms, the way she held herself, like she was conducting some kind of official government business. But there was something performative about it all, like she was playing a role she'd rehearsed. Her companion seemed nervous, constantly glancing at her for approval, which told me she was the driving force behind whatever this was. I wondered how many other families she'd already visited with this same routine, how many people had simply paid her fines without questioning her authority. I wiped my hands on my white t-shirt and walked over to the fence line where she stood. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think there's been some mistake. This ranch has been in my family since the 1890s. We're not part of any homeowners association." Deborah's smile widened, showing teeth so white they practically glowed. "Oh, but you are now, Mr. Maynard. Sonoran Vista HOA was legally established 18 months ago, encompassing all properties in this area. Your ignorance of our bylaws doesn't exempt you from compliance." She thrust a thick stack of papers at me, her eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the weight of every page, each one carrying a threat, a punishment that wasn't just bureaucratic, it was personal. "You're being fined $3,200 for unauthorized fence height, non-compliant paint colors, illegal livestock on residential property, and landscaping that doesn't meet community aesthetic standards." The papers felt surreal in my hands as I flipped through page after page of bureaucratic nonsense. According to their assessment, my chicken coop violated noise ordinances. My century-old mesquite tree was an unapproved species, and apparently, the natural red dirt of my driveway didn't meet their approved surface material standard. I looked up at Deborah, who was now attaching bright yellow violation notices to my chicken coop with zip ties, while one of her companions set up a small speaker system. "This is ridiculous," I said, trying to keep my voice calm for Maisie's sake, who was peeking out from behind the screen door. "These chickens have been here for 3 years. That tree is older than both of us combined." The violation notices fluttered in the desert wind like yellow flags of surrender, and I felt a surge of protective anger rise in my chest. This was my daughter's home, the place where she'd taken her first steps in the dirt between the cholla cacti, where she'd learned to gather eggs from our hens and helped me plant vegetables in the small garden behind the house. The idea that some stranger could come here and declare it all wrong, all non-compliant with standards we'd never agreed to follow, made my jaw clench with barely controlled fury. Deborah pressed a button and my quiet ranch was suddenly filled with her amplified voice reading HOA bylaws. Section 4.3. All residential properties must maintain grass lawns with approved seed varieties. Section 7.1. Fence height shall not exceed 4 feet without written approval. She turned off the speaker and smiled at me again. Mr. Maynard, you have exactly 5 days to remedy these violations and pay your fines, or we'll be forced to initiate foreclosure proceedings. We have the legal authority to seize non-compliant properties for the betterment of our community. She handed me one final document, a notice of intent to foreclose, that made my blood run cold. Have a blessed day, she said, clicking across my gravel in those ridiculous heels. As their car disappeared down the dirt road, Maisie came running out to me, her face full of worry. Daddy, are we really going to have to move? I knelt down and hugged her tight, smelling the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling the weight of protecting our home settle on my shoulders. Don't worry, sweetheart. Daddy's gonna figure this out. Nobody's taking our ranch away. As I stood there, watching those yellow notices flutter in the desert breeze, something snapped inside me. I wasn't just looking at a piece of paper. I was staring at the beginning of the biggest fight of my life. This wasn't just about fines or violations. This was about my home, my family, and the legacy I was determined to protect. I wasn't going to let some stranger steal it from me, and I had no idea what I was up against. Standing there in the growing dusk, holding my daughter and staring at those yellow notices, I made a silent promise to my grandfather's memory and to the generations of Maynards who'd called this place home. Whatever it took, however long it took, I wasn't going to let some wannabe bureaucrat in an orange suit steal our family's legacy. The fight was coming whether I wanted it or not, and I'd be damned if I was going to lose without giving everything I had. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with the kind of restless energy that comes from knowing your whole world might be about to change. I made coffee in the kitchen while watching the sun rise over the desert, painting the red cholla cacti in brilliant oranges and purples that would have made any artist weep. This was my view, my peace, my family's sanctuary. The idea that it could all be taken away because of some paperwork filed by a woman in an orange suit made my coffee taste bitter. I drove straight to the Pima County Recorder's office, leaving Loretta to handle the morning routine with Maisie. The building was one of those sterile government structures with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick, but I was determined to get answers about how an HOA could just suddenly claim authority over land that had been in my family for over a century. The clerk behind the counter, Betty, was a patient woman with silver hair and kind eyes who seemed genuinely interested in helping me understand what was happening. Betty helped me pull up the records for Sonoran Vista Homeowners Authority, and what I found made my stomach drop. The HOA had indeed been legally established 18 months ago by Deborah Winslow as the founding chairwoman. But here's what made my blood boil. Not a single property owner in the area had been notified of its creation. According to Arizona law, HOAs must notify residents, but no one in the area knew anything about this formation. This is highly irregular, Betty told me, scrolling through the digital records. If this is accurate, we're dealing with a serious problem. She leaned closer to her computer screen, frowning at what she was reading. Actually, there's a note here in the system. Miss Winslow was previously employed by Hartwell & Associates, a law firm downtown. She was terminated for falsifying documents in real estate transactions. I felt the first spark of hope I'd had since yesterday. If Deborah had a history of document fraud, maybe her HOA wasn't as legally solid as she claimed. Betty printed out everything she could find about the Sonoran Vista filing, and I left the courthouse with a thick stack of papers and a growing suspicion that I was dealing with something much more sinister than simple bureaucratic overreach. I drove over to Hartwell & Associates, where the receptionist, a young man with nervous energy, confirmed what Betty had told me. Deborah had worked there briefly as a junior associate before being fired for ethical violations involving client property documents. He couldn't give me details, but he didn't need to. The picture was becoming clearer. Deborah Winslow was a failed lawyer with a grudge and apparently enough legal knowledge to cause serious trouble. But I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, so I decided to visit every neighbor within a 2-mile radius of my ranch. What I discovered during those conversations was both heartbreaking and infuriating. My first stop was at the Martinez family's converted barn, where I found Carlos Martinez working on an old pickup truck in his driveway. Carlos had been living there for 6 years with his wife Maria and their 3 kids, slowly converting the barn into a proper house while working construction jobs to support his family. "Clint," Carlos said when I explained why I was there, "that woman came by here 3 weeks ago, told Maria we were in violation of about 20 different codes and had to pay $4,000 in fines or face legal action." His hands were shaking as he spoke, and I could see the stress lines around his eyes. "We don't have that kind of money, man. We've been saving every penny just to get the kids through school. Maria's been crying every night, thinking we're going to lose everything we've worked for." Carlos showed me a stack of violation notices that looked identical to mine, but with different alleged infractions: unpermitted structure, non-conforming residential use, inadequate landscaping, and a dozen other bureaucratic complaints. My next stop was old Pete's place, where I found him sitting outside his RV drinking coffee from a tin cup. Pete was a Vietnam veteran in his 70s who'd been living on his 5-acre plot for the better part of a decade, bothering absolutely nobody and maintaining his property better than most people with traditional houses. "She came by here too," Pete told me, his weathered face creased with worry. "Told me RVs weren't allowed as permanent residences and I had to either build a house or get off the land. Hell, Clint, I bought this property specifically because it was zoned for RV living. Now she's telling me I got 30 days to comply, or she's calling the county to have me forcibly removed." The pattern was becoming clear as I visited house after house, trailer after trailer, talking to families who'd been living peacefully in our little corner of the desert until Deborah Winslow decided to turn their lives upside down. Every single person had received violation notices, every single person had been threatened with foreclosure or forced removal, and every single person was terrified of losing their home to a legal system they couldn't afford to fight. At the Henderson place, a double-wide trailer where Bob and Sue Henderson had been living since they retired from teaching 15 years ago, I found Sue in tears at her kitchen table. "She told us our flower garden was creating a fire hazard," Sue said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Bob spent 10 years building that garden for me after my cancer treatments. It's the most beautiful thing we own, and she wants us to tear it all out and plant grass instead." "Grass, Clint? In the middle of the desert?" Bob sat beside his wife, holding her hand and looking older than his 72 years. "We're on a fixed income," he said quietly. "Social Security and our teachers' pensions. We can't afford lawyers or fines. If she forces this through, we'll have to sell and move in with our daughter in Tucson." On my way home, I stopped by Mrs. Eunice Webb's house, hoping to get some perspective from someone who'd been in the area longer than anyone else. I found her tending to her garden, wearing her usual sun hat and work gloves, looking exactly like the kind of grandmother everyone wishes they had. "Oh, Clint," she said when she saw me approaching, "I was hoping you'd come by. That awful woman has been terrorizing the entire neighborhood." Mrs. Webb invited me in for sweet tea and proceeded to tell me a story that made my anger turn white-hot. "She specifically targets older folks," Mrs. Webb explained, her hands shaking slightly as she set down her tea glass. "She knows we're on fixed incomes and can't fight back. Poor Lester Brooks, down the road, got fined $500 for putting up Christmas lights 2 weeks early. Can you imagine? The man's wife just passed away, and he was trying to do something cheerful for the holidays." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "But Clint, there's something else. That woman's husband, Rex Winslow, he's been asking around about buying property in this area. I heard from the postman that he's some kind of real estate developer looking to build a big resort. You don't suppose they're trying to force us all out so they can buy our land cheap?" The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I needed more information. I spent the rest of the afternoon installing security cameras around my property. 6 wireless units with night vision that I had ordered online months ago for general security but never got around to setting up. If Deborah wanted to play games, I was going to document every move she made. I also called my old friend Cal Larkin, who'd been the county sheriff for 15 years and knew more about local property law than most lawyers. "Clint," Cal said when I explained the situation, "your grandfather was one sharp cookie. When he bought that land back in 1892, he made sure to secure water rights, mineral rights, and something called perpetual ownership. I don't pretend to understand all the legal terminology, but I know it means his ownership was rock solid. You might want to dig deeper into those old property records." Cal's words gave me hope, but they also made me realize I was probably dealing with something much bigger than I'd initially thought. That evening, I gathered Loretta and Maisie in the living room and explained what I'd learned during my day of investigation. The look on Loretta's face when I told her about the Hendersons' flower garden and Carlos Martinez's family broke my heart. As a teacher, she understood better than anyone how devastating it could be for families to lose their homes and have their children uprooted from their schools and community. "So this woman is basically running a scam?" Loretta asked, her teacher instincts kicking in as she organized the information logically. "She creates a fake HOA, targets vulnerable people, and collects money while her husband scopes out property for development?" I nodded, feeling both relieved that we understood the scheme and terrified about what it meant for our family and our neighbors. "Clint, if we lose this fight, what happens to us?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I realized I didn't have a good answer yet. But I also realized that this wasn't just about us anymore. This was about an entire community of good people who were being victimized by a sophisticated fraud scheme. The answer to our problems came the next morning when I found Deborah back at my fence with all three of her companions, posting new violation notices. But this time, I was ready. My newly installed cameras captured everything as she trespassed on my property and discussed her real plans in what she thought was a private conversation. "Rex says we need this property cleared by spring," she told one of her companions, not knowing that my audio was crystal clear. "The resort investors are coming in March, and this whole area needs to look like a proper community, not some backwater collection of trailers and chicken coops." She looked directly at my house with pure contempt. One way or another, we're getting rid of all these people who don't understand progress. That night, I sat in my basement office, surrounded by boxes of my grandfather's papers that I'd inherited but never fully explored. But now, I had a different motivation for going through those dusty containers. It wasn't just about saving my own family's home anymore. It was about protecting an entire community of neighbors who'd become like family over the years. People who'd helped each other through tough times and celebrated each other's victories. Somewhere in these dusty documents was the key to saving not just my ranch, but the homes and dreams of everyone Deborah Winslow was trying to destroy. And I was going to find it, no matter how long it took. The war escalated quickly after that. I woke up Thursday morning to find my ranch entrance blocked by yellow caution tape, with official-looking signs reading, "Protected by terrorism, do not enter." Deborah and her crew were stationed at my gate like amateur security, photographing everyone who came and went. When Loretta tried to drive Maisie to school, they actually stepped in front of her car, forcing her to roll down the window while Deborah read a prepared statement through a bullhorn about ongoing safety violations that required restricted access until compliance was achieved. I watched this ridiculous theater from my kitchen window, sipping coffee from my favorite mug that Maisie had painted with "World's Best Dad" written in purple letters. The sight of my 8-year-old daughter's confused face as these adults played their power games made something snap inside me. I walked outside in my jeans and basic white t-shirt and calmly approached the group. "Ladies," I said, my voice carrying just enough edge to get their attention. "You're trespassing on private property and preventing my family from going about their daily business. I'm going to need you to move aside and remove your unauthorized signage. I won't let you destroy my family." Deborah's orange suit was even more garish in the morning sunlight. She raised her bullhorn again. "Mr. Maynard, your property is in violation of 17 separate community standards, and until these issues are resolved, we have the authority to restrict access for public safety." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Ma'am, I'm documenting this harassment for legal purposes. You have no authority over my property, and you're currently preventing my wife from taking our daughter to school. You have 60 seconds to clear this blockade before I call the sheriff." What happened next would have been hilarious if it wasn't so infuriating. One of her companions whispered something about maybe we should let them through, but Deborah grabbed the woman's arm and hissed, "We don't back down to troublemakers. That's how we lose control of the situation." The whole confrontation was being recorded by my security cameras, and I could see neighbors gathering at their windows, watching this bizarre standoff unfold. After exactly 60 seconds, I dialed 911 and reported a group of people unlawfully blocking my driveway. Sheriff Larkin arrived within 10 minutes. "Ms. Winslow," he said in his calm, authoritative voice, "I'm going to need you to explain your legal authority for blocking this private driveway." Deborah launched into a lengthy explanation about HOA enforcement powers, waving her stack of papers like they were holy scripture. Cal listened patiently, then walked over to examine the yellow tape and signs. "Ma'am, this appears to be an impersonation of official law enforcement barriers. HOAs don't have the authority to restrict access to private driveways, and these signs could be considered fraudulent government documents. The confrontation ended with Deborah and her crew reluctantly removing their blockade, but not before she promised this wasn't over. "Mr. Maynard, you're making a serious mistake by challenging legitimate community standards." As they drove away, I noticed Rex Winslow sitting in the passenger seat, taking photos of my property with a professional-looking camera. The development angle was becoming more obvious by the day. That afternoon brought an unexpected ally. Lester Brooks showed up at my door carrying a manila folder and wearing a determined expression. Lester was a retired accountant in his early 60s, the kind of methodical person who kept detailed records of everything. "Clint," he said, settling into my kitchen chair, "I need to show you something that's going to make you very angry." Inside his folder were copies of every interaction he'd had with Deborah's HOA. "I've been documenting everything since this started," he explained. "We'll handle this together. I won't let them do this to us." Lester's documentation was incredible. He had photos of Deborah's crew measuring his fence at midnight, copies of violation notices for excessive holiday decorations and non-conforming mailbox colors, and even audio recordings of threatening phone calls. Most damning of all, he had a clear photo of Rex Winslow taking measurements of his backyard while Deborah distracted him with paperwork at the front door. "So they're not just collecting fines," Lester said. "They're gathering intelligence for some kind of development project." That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going down to the basement to finally go through every single box of my grandfather's papers, no matter how long it took. By Friday morning, Deborah had declared total war. I woke up to find a process server at my door, with a lawsuit demanding $50,000 in damages plus attorney fees, requesting an emergency court order to immediately cease all harmful activities. The timing couldn't have been worse. Loretta spent the day making phone calls to find us a lawyer we could actually afford, while I researched property law online until my eyes burned. Every attorney we contacted wanted a retainer fee between $5,000 and $10,000 just to review the case, money we simply didn't have. Every day I feel like I'm being backed into a corner. The media attention made everything worse. Somehow, Deborah had convinced a local news reporter that our dispute was about community safety versus individual property rights. The evening news segment showed carefully selected footage of my rustic ranch while interviewing Deborah against newer, manicured homes. "We're simply trying to maintain community standards that protect everyone's property values," she said with that practiced smile. The reporter never contacted me for my side, never mentioned the HOA was created without proper notification, and never investigated Deborah's background. The segment made me look like a stubborn rancher who refused to maintain his property. Just when things couldn't get worse, an unexpected ally appeared. Thomas Richardson, the semi-retired attorney I'd contacted, showed up unannounced with his briefcase and a determined expression. "Mr. Maynard," he said, "I've seen this kind of fraudulent HOA scheme before, and I can't stand by and watch good people get steamrolled by crooks." Richardson had decided to take my case pro bono, calling it a clear-cut case of real estate fraud masquerading as community governance. His sudden appearance felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "We're going to hit them with everything at once," Richardson said, spreading legal documents on my kitchen table. "But first, we need to document every single interaction you've had with these people." He spent 2 hours going through my security camera footage, taking notes on every trespass, every threat, every violation. "They've given us enough evidence to bury them," he said with satisfaction. "The question is whether they're smart enough to back down before this gets really ugly." Wednesday night brought the breaking point. Around 11 p.m. I heard voices outside and found Deborah and 2 men examining my water pump system behind the house. When I approached them, one man told me they were conducting a routine safety inspection authorized by HOA bylaws. The confrontation got heated quickly, with Deborah accusing me of threatening behavior while I demanded they leave immediately. What I didn't know was that Deborah was recording the encounter, editing the footage to make it look like I had physically threatened her. But this time, I was prepared. My security cameras captured the entire encounter from multiple angles, including their actual conversation. "This pump system needs to be relocated," I heard one man say to Deborah. "It's going to interfere with the resort's water access plans." Deborah's response was even more damning. "Don't worry. Once we get these people out, we can restructure the whole water system however we need." They had no idea they were being recorded, and their casual discussion gave me exactly the evidence Richardson needed. By Thursday morning, Deborah's edited video was all over local social media, showing a cropped version where my raised voice and frustrated gestures looked threatening. The caption read, "Local property owner threatens HOA chairwoman during legitimate safety inspection. We can't let this opportunity slip away, Rex. If they won't sell, we'll use other methods." But I was ready to fight back. Richardson immediately filed an emergency motion, submitting my unedited security footage as evidence of Deborah's fraud. Sheriff Larkin showed up that afternoon, but instead of a grim expression, he was actually smiling. "Clint," he said, "I've got interesting news. That video Miss Winslow filed? It's been forensically analyzed and heavily edited. Your security footage tells a completely different story." Cal had brought along an FBI agent who specialized in real estate fraud. "Mr. Maynard," the agent said, "we've been investigating similar schemes across 3 states. Your documentation is exactly the evidence we need to shut down their entire network." That night was supposed to be the lowest point, but instead became the turning point. Loretta and I sat at our kitchen table, but this time we weren't surrounded by legal papers we couldn't afford to fight. Instead, we had Richardson's strategy, the FBI agent's business card, and a growing sense we might actually win. Maisie came running in, fresh from her bath in horse pajamas. "Daddy," she said, climbing onto my lap, "are the bad people going to go away now?" I hugged her tight and looked at Loretta, who was smiling for the first time in weeks. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, "I think they are." But I knew Deborah and Rex weren't going to give up without a fight. Their entire scheme was unraveling, and desperate people do desperate things. As I tucked Maisie into bed, I could see lights from their house across the desert, wondering what they were planning next. The morning would bring either their surrender or their most vicious attack yet. Either way, I was finally ready. The basement full of my grandfather's papers was calling to me, and I had a feeling the key to ending this nightmare was hidden in those dusty boxes. It was time to discover what my great-great-grandfather had really left me. The folder contained a hand-drawn map that looked like something from a history museum, complete with fountain pen notations and my great-great-grandfather's careful script. The survey showed property boundaries that extended far beyond what I'd always believed our family owned, encompassing not just our 20 acres, but nearly 200 acres of what was now called the Sonoran Vista Development. According to the original 1892 deed, Jeremiah Maynard had purchased the entire mesa from the territorial government, including water rights, mineral rights, and perpetual ownership. "Here it is, I found it." I spent the next 3 days at the county courthouse, armed with my grandfather's documents and a growing sense of excitement. Betty was fascinated by the historical papers and helped me trace the property's legal history through over a century of records. What we discovered was remarkable. The Maynard family had never actually sold or subdivided the majority of their original land purchase. Through bureaucratic oversights and assumed property transfers that were never properly documented, the county had somehow allowed development on land that technically still belonged to my family. Betty pulled up survey maps on her computer that showed the discrepancy clearly. If these documents are authentic, the entire Sonoran Vista development was built on land that was never legally separated from my family's ownership. I drove home in a daze, my truck loaded with copies of surveys, deeds, and legal precedents that painted a picture I was still struggling to believe. The HOA that had been terrorizing my family for weeks was operating on land that belonged to me. Every fine they'd collected, every threat they'd made, every community standard they'd enforced had been done without any legal authority whatsoever. I called Thomas Richardson, a semi-retired attorney who specialized in historical property disputes. When I spread my great-great-grandfather's documents across his conference table, his eyes lit up like a prospector finding gold. "Mr. Maynard," he said, examining the original survey with obvious excitement, "this is what we call a title lawyer's dream case. Your ancestor was remarkably thorough in securing his property rights, and it appears that subsequent owners and developers have been remarkably careless in verifying those rights." He spent 2 hours reviewing every document. "Here's what we're going to do," Richardson said, leaning back in his leather chair. "We're going to file a quiet title action to officially establish your ownership of the disputed property, and we're going to demand immediate cessation of all HOA activities on your land. But first, we're going to give them a chance to resolve this quietly." While Richardson prepared our legal strategy, I decided to conduct my own investigation into Deborah and Rex Winslow's activities. My security cameras had captured dozens of hours of footage, and when I reviewed it systematically, patterns emerged that were both revealing and infuriating. Rex had been systematically photographing and measuring properties throughout the neighborhood, always while Deborah distracted homeowners with HOA business. They had detailed files on every house, every improvement, every potential violation that could be used to pressure residents into selling. I also discovered that 3 families had already sold their homes to Rex's development company at well below market value, convinced by Deborah that increasing HOA fees and violation fines would make their properties unsellable to anyone else. It was a sophisticated scam combining legal intimidation with market manipulation, designed to acquire valuable desert property for development at a fraction of its actual worth. The breakthrough came when I contacted Frank Morrison, who'd moved to assisted living after selling his family's ranch 6 months earlier. "Son," he said, "that woman and her husband are crooks, plain and simple. They threatened to fine me into bankruptcy if I didn't bring my property up to their standards, then conveniently offered to buy me out when the estimates came back at over $30,000. That evening, I called Lester Brooks and Mrs. Webb to my house for what I dramatically announced as a community meeting. When they arrived, I spread out all my discoveries across the dining room table like a detective revealing the solution to a complex crime. The original survey maps, the county records, the evidence of the Winslow's development scheme, and Frank Morrison's recorded conversations painted a picture that was both incredible and completely logical. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "I believe we've been dealing with an elaborate real estate fraud, and I think I know how to stop it." We spent the next 2 hours planning our counterattack, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we had a real chance of winning. The final HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on Thursday evening at the community center, and I knew this was my one chance to expose the truth to the entire neighborhood. Deborah had sent out official-looking notices announcing a special assessment and foreclosure proceeding for non-compliant properties, basically trying to steamroll any remaining opposition through fear and intimidation. She had no idea that I'd spent the previous week quietly contacting every homeowner in the area, sharing my discoveries, and building a coalition of residents who were ready to fight back. Everything is in my hands now. I can't let them win. I arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a borrowed digital projector and a laptop loaded with everything I'd uncovered. The room was already half full, and I could see the division immediately. On one side sat Deborah's supporters, mostly newer residents who'd been convinced that strict HOA enforcement was necessary to protect their property values. On the other side were the people who'd been targeted by her harassment campaign, elderly residents on fixed incomes, families with children who couldn't afford thousands of dollars in compliance fines, and longtime neighbors who remembered what the area was like before Deborah's HOA existed. Deborah made her entrance at exactly 7 p.m. in an even more aggressive orange suit than usual, flanked by Rex and their attorney, a nervous-looking young man carrying an expensive briefcase. She'd clearly prepared for a victory lap, with professionally printed charts showing community improvement statistics and a presentation about maintaining neighborhood standards for collective prosperity. The confidence in her voice as she called the meeting to order suggested she had no idea what was about to hit her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Deborah began, clicking to her first slide, "tonight we're here to address the final non-compliant properties in our community and establish the enforcement mechanisms necessary to maintain our standards going forward." She launched into a 20-minute presentation about property values, community aesthetics, and the importance of collective responsibility over individual preferences. Every few minutes, she'd glance in my direction with a smug smile that said she thought she'd already won this fight. Her presentation culminated with a detailed plan to foreclose on 3 properties, mine, Lester's, and Mrs. Webb's, and transfer them to responsible ownership that would benefit the entire community. When she finished, the room was uncomfortably quiet. A few of her supporters clapped politely, but most people seemed unsure about what they'd just heard. Deborah looked around the room with satisfaction, then made the mistake that would end her reign of terror. "Are there any questions or comments before we proceed to the foreclosure vote?" she asked, clearly expecting either silence or softball questions from her allies. Instead, I stood up from my seat in the back row, holding my laptop and projector cables, and said the words I'd been practicing for days. "Actually, Deborah, I have a few things to share with the community that I think will change tonight's agenda considerably." The room went dead silent as I walked to the front and began setting up my equipment. Deborah's face went through several interesting color changes as she realized I wasn't just going to sit quietly and accept whatever she'd planned. "Mr. Maynard," she said, her voice rising an octave, "this is a properly called HOA meeting with an established agenda. You can't just—" But her objection was drowned out by murmurs from the crowd as my first slide appeared on the screen. the original 1892 survey map showing the true boundaries of the Maynard family property. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, turning to face the room full of my neighbors, "everything you've been told about property ownership in this area is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually owns what." I clicked to the next slide, showing the county records that proved my family had never sold or subdivided the majority of our original land purchase. According to documentation that I've verified with county records and independent legal analysis, the Maynard family still owns the mineral rights, water rights, and underlying land ownership for this entire development, which means that the Sonoran Vista Homeowners Authority has been operating without any legal foundation whatsoever. The room erupted in shocked conversations as people processed what I'd just told them. Deborah was frantically whispering with Rex and their attorney, who was pulling documents out of his briefcase and looking increasingly panicked. "You'll pay for this!" Deborah shouted over the crowd noise, stepping toward my projector, but her protests were drowned out as I clipped to my next slide. Frank Morrison's recorded conversations, where Rex explicitly admitted that HOA fines were designed to force property sales. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have evidence that this entire HOA scheme has been a deliberate fraud designed to acquire valuable property for development at below market prices." The moment that really sealed their fate came when Rex Winslow made the biggest mistake of his life. Instead of staying quiet, he jumped up from his seat and tried to salvage the evening with an impromptu bribery attempt. "Look, Mr. Maynard," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're obviously upset about some paperwork confusion, but let's be reasonable here. I'm prepared to offer you $1 million for your property right now, tonight. No questions asked." The room went completely silent as people realized they'd just witnessed an admission of guilt delivered with spectacular stupidity. I looked around the room at 50-plus neighbors who'd just heard a real estate developer offer me $1 million for land he'd been claiming was worthless and non-compliant. Then I looked directly at the crowd and said the line I'd been planning for this exact moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've lived my entire life without fighting for power or control, but tonight I'm fighting for land. And as of right now, I'm declaring that every HOA fine collected, every harassment campaign conducted, and every threat made against residents of this neighborhood has been done on property that belongs to my family and is being done without my permission." The meeting dissolved into complete chaos after that, but through all the shouting and confusion, I could see something wonderful happening. My neighbors were finally free. The aftermath of the community meeting was swift and brutal for Deborah and Rex Winslow. Within 48 hours, 3 separate legal actions had been filed against them. My quiet title lawsuit to establish property ownership, a class action suit by residents demanding refunds of illegally collected fines, and a criminal complaint filed by the county attorney's office for real estate fraud. The local news that had previously portrayed me as an unreasonable property owner suddenly couldn't get enough of the HOA fraud scandal, and reporters were camped outside the Winslow house. Deborah's final desperate lawsuit attempt was perhaps the most pathetic thing I witnessed during the entire ordeal. She actually tried to sue me in federal court, claiming that my hostile takeover of community governance violated her civil rights, and demanding damages for emotional distress and professional defamation. The federal judge took exactly 12 minutes to dismiss the case, fining Deborah $15,000 for filing what he called a frivolous lawsuit that wastes this court's time and resources. The courtroom video of Deborah's meltdown, screaming about conspiracy and illegal property theft as security escorted her out, went viral on every social media platform within hours. Rex's business empire collapsed even faster than his wife's legal challenges. The FBI's white-collar crime unit opened an investigation into his development company's financing, uncovered evidence of bank fraud and money laundering, and froze all his assets pending criminal charges. The Desert Oasis Resort project was canceled immediately, leaving Rex facing potential federal prison time and complete financial ruin. Within a week, Deborah had filed for divorce and moved back in with her mother in Phoenix, abandoning her husband to face the legal consequences of their scheme alone. The most satisfying moment of justice came 3 weeks later, when I was working in my garden and heard a commotion near my property line. I looked up to see Deborah in an Orange County jail jumpsuit, instead of her signature business suit, picking up litter along the roadside as part of her court-ordered community service. The judge had sentenced her to 30 days of community service specifically in our neighborhood, cleaning up the very area she'd spent months trying to control. When our eyes met across the fence, she quickly looked away and continued stuffing trash into her collection bag, a perfect metaphor for how her dreams of power had ended up. The transformation of our community was remarkable. Without the fear of arbitrary fines and harassment, neighbors started talking to each other again, children played in yards without worrying about noise violations, and people began personalizing their properties in ways that reflected their individual personalities rather than some imaginary community standard. Mrs. Webb planted a spectacular rose garden that would have violated 6 different HOA regulations. Lester Brooks put up a Christmas light display in July that made the entire neighborhood smile, and my chickens continued pecking around their coop, blissfully unaware that they'd been at the center of a legal battle that made statewide news. "Thank you, Clint. You helped us see the truth," Lester said one evening as we watched the sunset together. I established what we called the Red Cholla Community Cooperative, a voluntary association that handled genuinely necessary community issues like road maintenance and utility coordination without the authoritarian structure of a traditional HOA. Instead of fines and violations, we used common sense and neighborly discussion to solve problems. Instead of architectural control committees, we trusted people to maintain their properties in ways that worked for their families. The monthly dues were $50 instead of $300, and every decision was made democratically rather than by decree from a self-appointed board of directors. The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. A publisher contacted me about writing a book on the experience. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell our story as part of a larger examination of HOA abuse across America. Several other communities dealing with similar situations reached out for advice on fighting back against harassment and fraud. What had started as a defense of my family's home had somehow become a symbol of resistance against bureaucratic bullying and corporate greed. But the most meaningful outcome was the effect on my family. Maisie was now proud to tell her friends about how her daddy had beat the bad lady who tried to steal our ranch. Loretta returned to her teaching with renewed energy, no longer carrying the stress of wondering whether we'd be able to afford legal bills or HOA fines. The final irony came 6 months later when I received an email from a community in Nevada facing their own HOA nightmare. "Mr. Maynard," the message began, "we've read about your situation and we're wondering if you could help us with our Karen problem." I looked at the email for a long moment, then walked outside to check on my chickens and admire the desert sunset painting the red cholla cacti in brilliant colors. Loretta joined me on the porch and we sat in comfortable silence, watching our daughter play in the yard of the home that would always belong to our family. "So," Loretta said eventually, "are you going to help those people in Nevada?" I smiled and put my arm around her, feeling the satisfaction of a man who'd discovered that sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and sometimes the most powerful weapon you can have is the truth. "Maybe," I said, watching Maisie chase our chickens around their coop with the kind of carefree laughter that makes everything else worthwhile. Finally, I protected my family. Because at the end of the day, that's what this whole fight had been about. The right to be home, to live peacefully on land that belonged to us, and to raise our family according to our own values, rather than someone else's idea of community standards. And now, thanks to one woman's greed and one family's determination to fight back, that right was secure for another generation of Maynards. Sometimes, you don't need to win every battle, you just need your enemies to admit they've lost.